Maria's fingers danced across the console, adjusting levels and queuing up the next track. The familiar hum of equipment and the soft glow of monitors enveloped her in the cocoon of the radio station. It was just another day on air, or so she thought. The news ticker in the corner of her screen flashed with increasingly alarming headlines, but Maria, ever the professional, kept her voice steady as she addressed her listeners. Good morning, New York. It's 7 a.m., and you're listening to WXNY. I'm Maria Santos, bringing you the soundtrack to your day. Little did she know, it would be the soundtrack to the end of the world as they knew it. As the morning progressed, the trickle of unsettling news became a torrent. Reports of a rapidly spreading virus overwhelmed hospitals, and cities in lockdown flooded in. Maria's producer rushed into the booth, his face ashen. "We need to switch to emergency broadcast mode," he said, his voice trembling. Maria nodded, her heart racing as she realized the gravity of the situation. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before addressing her listeners once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our regular programming to bring you an important announcement." For the next several hours, Maria became the voice of calm in a world descending into chaos. She relayed official instructions, dispelled rumors, and tried to offer comfort to a terrified populace. But as the day wore on, the situation outside grew increasingly dire. The streets below the towering radio station, usually bustling with life, fell eerily silent. One by one, her colleagues left, rushing home to their families or seeking safer ground. Yet Maria remained, driven by a sense of duty and the nagging fear that if she left, there might be no safe place to return to. As night fell, Maria found herself alone in the station, the weight of solitude settling heavily upon her shoulders. The once comforting hum of equipment now seemed to mock the silence of the world outside. She stared at the microphone, her lifeline to a world that was rapidly unraveling. In that moment, Maria made a decision that would shape the next 5 years of her life. She would stay. This station, high above the chaos below, would be her fortress, her lifeline, and perhaps, the last beacon of hope for anyone still listening. The question that echoed in her mind as she prepared for her first night in isolation was chilling. In a world torn apart by an invisible enemy, could one voice make a difference? As Maria settled into her new reality, she couldn't help but wonder, what would tomorrow bring in this strange new world? And more importantly, would there be anyone left to hear her? As dawn broke on the first day of Maria's self-imposed isolation, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The radio station, once a bustling hub of activity, now stood as a silent sentinel high above the desolate cityscape. Maria moved through the familiar corridors, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness, as she took stock of her new home and fortress. The station's emergency protocols, designed for natural disasters, now served as a lifeline in this unthinkable scenario. Stockpiles of non-perishable food, water purification systems, and backup generators offered a semblance of security. Yet, as Maria inventoried her supplies, the gravity of her decision to stay weighed heavily upon her. How long could she survive here? And to what end? Establishing a routine became Maria's anchor in the sea of uncertainty. Each morning, she would check the building's security systems, rationing supplies with meticulous care. The radio equipment, her connection to the outside world, required daily maintenance. Though the airwaves remained chillingly silent, Maria clung to the hope that someone, somewhere, might be listening. As days turned into weeks, the silence of the world below became an entity in itself, a presence that threatened to overwhelm her. To combat the creeping tendrils of loneliness, Maria began talking to herself, her voice a lifeline in the oppressive quiet. She would narrate her daily activities, share her thoughts, and even argue with imaginary companions, anything to fill the void. The view from the station's windows, once a panoramic spectacle of city life, now served as a grim reminder of the world's transformation. Streets once teeming with traffic lay empty, save for the occasional animal reclaiming urban territory. Nature, it seemed, was quick to assert itself in humanity's absence. Nights proved to be the most challenging. As darkness fell, the soft glow of emergency lights cast eerie shadows, and every creak and groan of the building played tricks on Maria's mind. She found herself sleeping in short bursts, always alert for any sign of threat or change. Yet, amidst the solitude and fear, Maria discovered an inner strength she never knew she possessed. Each day of survival was a small victory, a testament to her resilience. She began to view her isolation not just as a burden, but as a responsibility. If she could endure, if she could maintain her humanity in the face of this apocalypse, perhaps there was hope for the world at large. As weeks stretched into months, Maria grappled with profound questions. What defines us when society crumbles? How does one maintain hope in the face of overwhelming despair? And perhaps most poignantly, in a world of silence, does a voice unheard still have meaning? These questions would haunt Maria as she continued her solitary existence, high above the silent city. Little did she know, her greatest challenges, and unexpected connections, lay ahead. In the quiet of her sky-high fortress, Maria steeled herself for whatever the future might hold, her spirit unbroken, her voice ready to pierce the silence when the time came. As the days blurred into an endless stream of solitude, Maria found herself clinging to the one thing that had defined her life before the apocalypse, her voice. In a world of deafening silence, she made the decision to continue broadcasting, even if no one was listening. Every morning, she would sit before the microphone, clear her throat, and speak into the void. Good morning, New York. This is Maria Santos, broadcasting from WXNY. It's day 93 of the global pandemic, and if you're out there, you're not alone. Her words echoed through the empty studio, a stark contrast to the bustling energy that once filled the space. But for Maria, these daily broadcasts became more than just a routine, they were a lifeline, a thread of sanity in an increasingly surreal existence. As she spoke, Maria painted vivid pictures of life before the catastrophe. She described the smell of fresh bagels from the corner bakery, the cacophony of honking taxis, and the vibrant energy of Times Square. These weren't just stories, they were a testament to a world that once was, a reminder of what humanity had lost and what, perhaps, could one day be again. But it wasn't all nostalgia. Maria used her broadcasts to process her own emotions, to voice her fears and hopes. Sometimes, she confessed one quiet afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper, I wonder if I'm the last person left. If my voice is just echoing into nothingness. But then I remember that hope is a choice, and today, I choose to believe that someone out there is listening. As weeks turned into months, Maria's imaginary audience began to take on a life of its own. She created personalities for her listeners, Sarah, the nurse who had stayed behind to care for the sick, Tom, the retired veteran who was no stranger to isolation, and little Amy, a child separated from her parents in the chaos. These fictional characters became her companions, her confidants, and in many ways, her reason for continuing. Maria found herself engaging in conversations with these imaginary listeners, answering questions they might ask, offering comfort for their invented struggles. Yes, Tom, I know the silence can be deafening, she'd say, nodding as if responding to a call-in. But remember, silence also holds possibility. It's a blank canvas waiting for us to fill it with new stories, new hopes. Yet, as comforting as these imaginary connections were, They also highlighted the brutal reality of Maria's isolation. There were moments when the line between reality and fantasy blurred, when she caught herself expecting a real response, only to be met with the unforgiving silence of the empty station. The weight of solitude pressed heavily on Maria's psyche. There were days when speaking into the microphone felt like shouting into an abyss, her words swallowed by the vastness of her loneliness. But still, she persisted. Because in a world where everything familiar had been stripped away, her voice, whether heard or not, was a declaration of her existence, a defiant stand against the silence that threatened to engulf her. As Maria signed off each night, she faced the same haunting question: in a world without listeners, what is the value of a voice? Does speaking to an empty world still hold meaning? And in the depths of her solitude, a new fear began to take root. If she ever did make contact with other survivors, would she remember how to truly connect? The dwindling supplies in the radio station's stockroom forced Maria to confront a terrifying reality. She would need to venture into the abandoned city below. As she stood at the window, gazing down at the overgrown streets and decaying buildings, her heart raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The world she once knew had become an alien landscape, fraught with unknown dangers. Steeling herself, Maria packed a backpack with essentials: a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a makeshift weapon, a metal pipe she'd removed from the station's maintenance room. With trembling hands, she opened the heavy door that had kept her safe for months. The stale air of the stairwell hit her like a physical force, a stark reminder of how long she'd been isolated. As Maria emerged onto the street, the eerie silence enveloped her. The once bustling avenue was now a tangle of abandoned vehicles and encroaching vegetation. Nature, it seemed, was quick to reclaim its territory. She moved cautiously, every sense on high alert, painfully aware of how exposed she was after months of security. Her first destination was a nearby grocery store. The shattered windows and ransacked shelves told a story of panic and desperation. As Maria carefully picked through the remaining items, a sudden noise froze her in place. The sound of shuffling feet echoed from the back of the store. Her grip tightened on the metal pipe as a figure emerged from the shadows. The man was gaunt, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and aggression. "This is my territory," he growled, brandishing a jagged piece of glass. Maria's mind raced, searching for the right words to defuse the situation. "I'm not here to take anything from you," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm just looking for food, like you." For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. But then, something in the man's eyes shifted. Perhaps it was the sound of another human voice after so long, or maybe a flicker of recognition that they were both survivors in this desolate world. Whatever the reason, he lowered his weapon. "Take what you need and go," he muttered, retreating into the shadows. This encounter shook Maria to her core, reminding her of the fragile nature of humanity in the face of overwhelming adversity. As she hurried back to the safety of her radio tower, questions swirled in her mind. How many others were out there, driven to desperation by isolation and scarcity? Had she been naive to think that kindness and reason could prevail in this new world? Back in the relative safety of the station, Maria's relief was tinged with a new sense of isolation. The brief, hostile interaction had paradoxically intensified her loneliness. She realized that survival wasn't just about food and shelter, it was about maintaining one's humanity in the face of unimaginable challenges. As she sorted through her scavenged supplies, Maria wrestled with conflicting emotions. The urge to barricade herself in the tower, never to venture out again, warred with the undeniable need for resources and the faint hope of finding allies in this desolate landscape. That night, as she prepared for her usual broadcast, Maria's voice trembled slightly. To anyone out there listening, she began, "I want you to know that we're not alone. There are others surviving, just like us. But survival isn't enough. We need to remember our humanity, our compassion. Because if we lose that, what are we really fighting to preserve?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. As Maria signed off, she couldn't help but wonder, in a world where every encounter could be life-threatening, how does one balance self-preservation with the need for human connection? And more importantly, how long could she maintain her own sense of empathy and hope in the face of such a harsh reality? 1,825 days. 5 years of solitude, of speaking into the void, of hoping against hope. As Maria awoke on this milestone day, the weight of time pressed down on her with an almost physical force. The radio station, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in, whispering of wasted years and lost chances. She went through her morning routine mechanically, checking supplies, testing equipment, preparing for another broadcast that no one would hear. But today, something was different. As she sat before the microphone, words failed her for the first time in 5 years. The silence stretched on, oppressive and mocking. "What's the point?" Maria whispered, her voice cracking. "Is anyone even out there?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. For 5 years, she had clung to the belief that her voice mattered, that someone, somewhere, might be listening. But now, doubt crept in like a poison, seeping into every corner of her mind. Maria's gaze drifted to the window, to the city below that had become a stranger to her. Nature had reclaimed much of what was once a thriving metropolis. Trees grew through cracked pavement, and wildlife roamed freely through abandoned streets. It was beautiful, in its way, a world reborn. But it was a world that seemed to have no place for her. Memories of her past life flooded her mind, the warmth of human touch, the sound of laughter, the simple joy of shared meals. These recollections, once a source of comfort, now felt like cruel reminders of all she had lost. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 5 years suddenly became unbearable. Maria found herself moving through the station, touching familiar objects as if saying goodbye. Her fingers lingered on the microphone, her lifeline for so long. She made her way to the roof, feeling the warm sun on her face for the first time in months. The vastness of the sky above and the silent city below emphasized her insignificance. Standing at the edge of the roof, Maria closed her eyes. One step. That's all it would take to end the loneliness, the fear, the constant struggle. Just one step into the void. The thought was terrifying, yet strangely comforting. An end to the unending silence. As she stood there, teetering on the brink both literally and figuratively, questions raced through her mind. Was hope just a cruel illusion? Had her efforts to maintain her humanity been in vain? In a world seemingly devoid of human connection, what was the value of a single life? Maria opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She took a deep breath, ready to make a decision that would change everything. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as she steeled herself for what might have been her final act, a sound broke through the silence, a sound she hadn't heard in 5 long years. It was faint, barely audible above the wind. But it was unmistakable. Static. Coming from the radio in her studio. Static, and then, a voice. Distant, broken, but undeniably human. Maria froze, her heart pounding. Was this real, or had she finally succumbed to madness? The voice came again, slightly clearer this time. Is anyone out there? Please, if anyone can hear this. In that moment, standing on the precipice between despair and hope, Maria faced the most crucial decision of her life. Would she answer the call, risking disappointment and heartbreak? Or had she already lost too much of herself to reach out one more time? The voice crackled through the air again, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. What would Maria choose? And how would her decision shape not just her future, but potentially the future of a world struggling to rebuild? Maria's legs trembled as she raced back to the studio, her heart pounding in her ears. The voice on the radio continued to crackle through the speakers, each word a lifeline pulling her back from the brink. With shaking hands, she grasped the microphone, hesitating for a split second before pressing the transmit button. Hello? Is someone there? Her voice, unused to real conversation, sounded foreign to her own ears. There was a moment of agonizing silence, then the voice returned, clearer this time. Oh my God, yes. Yes, we're here. Can you hear us? The words were like electricity, jolting Maria's world back into vivid color. She wasn't alone. After 5 years of speaking into the void, someone was finally listening. I hear you, Maria replied, tears streaming down her face. I'm Maria. I've been broadcasting from New York City for 5 years. Where are you? The response came from a man named David, part of a small community of survivors in rural Pennsylvania. They had been trying to establish contact with other groups for months, scanning different frequencies daily. As Maria and David exchanged information, the reality of this connection began to sink in. It wasn't just about breaking her isolation, it was about the possibility of a larger world still out there, struggling to rebuild. David spoke of other communities they had made contact with, of efforts to recreate some semblance of society. For hours, Maria listened and shared, learning about the state of the world beyond her radio tower. The virus had indeed devastated the global population, but pockets of humanity had survived, adapting to the new reality. Some groups had managed to maintain rudimentary technology, while others had reverted to simpler ways of life. As the conversation progressed, Maria felt a shift within herself. The despair that had nearly consumed her earlier was being replaced by something she had almost forgotten: purpose. Her years of broadcasting hadn't been in vain. She had maintained a beacon of hope, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. Maria, David said, his voice filled with emotion, you don't know what it means to hear another voice from a major city. We've been trying to contact urban centers for so long. Your broadcasts, your persistence, it's invaluable. The weight of this realization settled on Maria. Her role was changing. No longer was she just a voice in the darkness, she was now a crucial link in the effort to reconnect scattered communities. The radio station, once her prison, was transforming into a hub of communication and hope. As the night wore on, Maria and David made plans. She would continue broadcasting, but now with renewed purpose, relaying messages between communities, sharing vital information about resources and safe zones. Her years of solitude had prepared her for this moment, giving her an intimate knowledge of the city and its remaining resources. When the time came to end the transmission for the night, Maria felt a momentary panic. What if this had all been a dream? What if she woke up tomorrow to find herself alone again? As if sensing her fear, David's voice came through one last time. We'll contact you again tomorrow, same time. You're not alone anymore, Maria. None of us are. As Maria prepared for sleep that night, her mind raced with possibilities. How would this connection change her life? What role could she play in the rebuilding of society? The future, for the first time in years, held promise. Yet, amidst the excitement, questions lingered. How would she adapt to human interaction after so long alone? Could she bear the weight of being a lifeline for so many? And perhaps most pressingly, How would she navigate the dangers of a world she had been isolated from for so long? As she drifted off to sleep, Maria realized that tomorrow would bring a new chapter in her life. The voice in the void had been heard, and now, the real work of reconnecting humanity would begin. What challenges and opportunities awaited in this new dawn? The days that followed Maria's first contact with David and his community were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The radio station, once a monument to isolation, hummed with renewed purpose. Maria's voice, which had for so long echoed into silence, now carried hope and connection across the airwaves to an ever-growing network of survivors. Each day brought new voices, new stories of survival, and new challenges to overcome. Maria found herself at the center of a web of communication, relaying messages between scattered communities, coordinating supply runs, and sharing vital information about safe zones and potential dangers. Her years of solitary broadcasting had unknowingly prepared her for this role, giving her an encyclopedic knowledge of the city's layout and resources. As Maria's network expanded, so did the complexity of her task. She began developing a system to organize the flood of information pouring in from various groups. Maps of the city were marked with safe zones, danger areas, and resource caches. She created schedules for different communities to broadcast, ensuring everyone had a chance to share and receive information. The transformation of the radio station was profound. Walls once bare now bore charts, maps, and lists. The silent corridors echoed with Maria's voice as she moved from room to room, managing different broadcasts and coordinating efforts. For the first time in years, the station felt alive. Yet, with this rebirth came new challenges. The more Maria connected with others, the more she realized how much the world had changed. Stories of makeshift governments, bartering systems, and new social structures both fascinated and overwhelmed her. She grappled with the realization that while she had been preserving a piece of the old world, a new one had been taking shape outside her tower. Maria's role as a central figure in this new network of communication also brought unexpected emotional challenges. After years of isolation, the constant interaction, even if only through radio, was intense. There were moments when she longed for the simplicity of her solitary existence, followed by waves of guilt for even considering such thoughts. As weeks passed, Maria began to notice changes in herself. The woman who had stood on the brink of despair was fading, replaced by someone more resilient, more connected to the world around her. She found herself laughing at jokes shared over the airwaves, crying with those who shared tales of loss, and feeling a sense of community she had thought lost forever. One evening, as Maria prepared for her nightly broadcast, she paused to look out over the city. The view that had once represented her isolation now seemed full of possibility. In the distance, she could see small lights flickering, signs of life returning to the urban landscape. It was a stark reminder of how much had changed, and how much work still lay ahead. As she sat before the microphone, Maria took a deep breath. "Good evening," she began, her voice strong and clear. "This is Maria Santos, broadcasting from WXNY in New York City. To all of you out there rebuilding, connecting, and hoping, you are not alone. We are in this together, and together, we will shape the world to come." The response was immediate, a chorus of voices from different communities, acknowledging her words, sharing their own messages of hope and determination. In that moment, Maria felt the true power of what they were creating, not just a network of survival, but a rebirth of human connection. As she signed off that night, Maria pondered the journey that had brought her to this point. From the last voice of a dying world to the first voice of a world reborn, she had come full circle. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges she could only begin to imagine. How would society rebuild itself? What role would she play in shaping this new world? And perhaps most importantly, as the barriers of isolation fell away, how would Maria herself change? The woman who had survived 5 years of solitude was stepping into a new role, one that would require her to balance her hard-won self-reliance with the need for human connection. As the night settled over the awakening city, Maria realized that her journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The rebirth of the airwaves was not just about communication, it was about rekindling the spark of humanity in a world that had nearly lost it. And in that rekindling, Maria found not just purpose, but a new kind of hope, one built on the collective strength of voices once lost, now found.